continue looking at some timelines and genealogies in the Bible. And so last week we looked at the pre-flood patriarchs, and we saw in the Bible showing us two main lines. We've got the line of Seth. Obviously, it does not even attempt to name everyone that there was. It's naming the key figures, probably the leaders of these different groups. And Seth obviously became the leader of the godly line, and you have the sons of God in there, but then we follow the line of Cain, and then it shows when we get to Lamech how things start really going south in Cain's line. In chapter 6, we see the uniting of the two lines corrupting the entire world, and because that's what happens when corruption spreads. I'm throwing all my notes everywhere. Corruption always spreads, and the only way that righteousness can spread is through Jesus Christ. And so just like Adam's sin, it's something that has passed upon all. We need the righteousness of Christ to come on us if we want to have any hope of salvation. And so we saw the two lines, and basically we had Noah, though, who was righteous in his generations. He is not connected to Cain. And Noah has three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so I'm going to just kind of write on here for perspective. So everyone in the world comes from Noah. You know, we often say Adam, and that's true. But more specifically, you know, somebody who came along 1,656 years later, or 1,156 years later, something like that, is we have Noah. And then Noah had three sons. He has Shem, who was not the firstborn, but he's the most important one. And then we have Ham, and then we have Japheth. Those are the three sons of Noah. So now, all the nations, you know, that we're about to see in Genesis, they're all going to come from these three main guys. And the genealogies that are in the Bible, they're there for a reason. And I want to point out a few things about these three individuals and the people who come from them. And I think it'll really help put some things in perspective in the Bible. So let's go ahead, though, and start reading in Genesis 9, in verse 18. It says, "And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan." Okay, so notice how it mentions that right away, how Ham is the father of Canaan. Now, this is really important because what's one of the things that we mentioned last week? The book of Genesis, right, or the books of Moses. Moses wrote these things towards the end of the 40-year wandering in the wilderness. Before he passes off the scene, he gives these things, and we see where they put these books and they put them in the Ark of the Covenant. And so Noah is writing all these things that are very relevant to Israel as they are getting ready to go into the Promised Land, which at that time was the land of Canaan. So there is special emphasis that we're about to see here on Canaan, because we have the Hebrews that come from Shem, and we'll see some of that in a little bit. And then eventually we get to the children of Israel, and then they are going to go and basically take over the land of these people. And understand, these are a cursed people. These people are cursed, and they were not supposed to be mixing with the Canaanites. They were a very wicked people. And so in chapter 9 here, we're seeing this emphasis about Canaan. And it says, "Now these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread." Okay? So again, everyone died in the flood. Everyone comes from these three guys. And so it says, "Noah began to be a husbandman, he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant, and God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So notice that not only does Noah curse, he doesn't curse Ham, he curses Canaan, but he also blesses Shem and Japheth. Okay? Now, if I just may throw this out, I've heard some people say that Noah was not able to curse Ham because even though what he did was really bad, Ham was probably saved because of the fact too, he was one of them that went into the ark, and so he wasn't able to curse him, but he did curse his son. He did curse his offspring. And I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thought because, I mean, it wasn't Canaan that did it. But, you know, it also wasn't Cain's descendants who had done what Cain had done. But these things, you know, God visits the iniquities of the father on the children to the third and fourth generation. And we see that in the Bible. And there are bad things often in the scriptures. We see them being passed down to the next generations. And you say, well, what if I come from a wicked family? Well, we have something very blessed that we can have is we can be born again. You know, we can become a part of the family of God. So we don't need to worry about this stuff. But understand, you know, these are real things. These are real problems, real curses that had real consequences and real results. And so, just kind of try to keep all these things in mind. And so now let's get into chapter 10. It says, Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tyrus. Of the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarmah, and the sons of Javan, Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim and Dodman. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. So I want you to notice a few things. First off, we see Magog mentioned in there. Everybody likes to talk about Gog and Magog. Okay? And we're not going to take time to read it, but in the Bible, when it's talking about Gog and Magog, and it mentions several other names too. Those are the ones everybody remembers, but it mentions a bunch of other names. Some of those names that are mentioned, we see that mentioned here in Genesis chapter 10. Ultimately, what I believe Gog and Magog is a reference to is the Gentiles, okay, or the heathen. So from Japheth comes the Gentiles. Okay, now here's where people get a little confused sometimes. We often think of Gentiles of anyone that's not a Jew, because again, you know, from the Hebrews comes the Jews, right? And so we often think about anyone, if you're just not a Jew, you're a Gentile. But here's what people need to understand. Originally, Gentile was a little more specific for a reason. They were the people that came from Japheth. And so it was still that way when we're in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, where it talks about Gog and Magog. And so ultimately what we're seeing there is a reference or a prophecy that was about the Gentiles, not necessarily everyone who was not a Jew. Okay? And I think too, in Revelation, when we see that, you know, Gentile and heathen are kind of synonymous. And also nations. Whenever you see in the Bible, those words are used interchangeably. Gentiles, heathen, nations, they're used interchangeably. And there's a reason when we get to the time of Christ that we have Jews and Gentiles. There's a reason for that, and I'll show that what kind of changed as we go. But here in Genesis, there's not just Jews and Gentiles. In fact, there's no such thing as a Jew yet. But there were Gentiles, okay? So keep that in mind. But we're lost my spot. So let's jump down to verse. Oh yeah, another thing too. You notice Ashkenaz mentioned in there too, which is probably where most of the Jews of today come from. The Orthodox ones anyway. They're actually Gentiles too. But you know what? They're of the same spirit of the Jews of Jesus' day. So you know what? I'll just give it to them. because they're definitely of the same spirit. So anyway, verse 6, notice it says, and the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. Okay, so from Ham, and now I'm not going to have these like in order from where they descend from because I already started out writing this wrong. But note Mizraim is mentioned. Does anybody know who came from Mizraim? Exactly, the Egyptians. They also come from Ham. So can you see why some of these things are kind of important history? Because when Moses is giving this to Israel too, he's showing the origin too of the people that the Hebrews had just come out of their land. They had been in captivity with these people. So during the during these early years, we're seeing the Hebrews, okay, we're seeing them have all kinds of problems with Ham. We're going to see first with the Egyptians, later with the Canaanites. You know where we don't see them having a whole lot of problems in their early days is from people like the Syrians. Okay, now the Syrians, did you know, anybody know a very famous Syrian in Genesis? His name was Abraham. Abraham was from, so the Assyrians, or like the Assyrians, they're actually of Shem. Okay, so we'll write down the Assyrians over here. Now the Assyrians are going to become a big deal much later, because later the Assyrians are going to be the ones that are going to take the northern kingdom of Israel captive. Later when the kingdom split. So they had a lot of problems during that time. That wasn't the Gentiles, that was the Assyrians. Okay? And they're from Shem. So we see the Hebrews, not necessarily the Hebrews, or the Jews, or Israel, they don't really become Jews until after the kingdom split. But the Israelites, we see them later starting to have a lot of problems with the Assyrians, but it's from Shem. So early, the problems that they had were with Ham. And then later, they start having problems with people from Shem. And then, after the Assyrian Empire, we have the Babylonians, which were probably all more, they would have been more from Ham, maybe mixed, because then you have the Persians, too. But then, after the Greek Empire, that's when they start having problems with the Gentiles. Okay? And so Israel, they've always had problems with everybody. From Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it doesn't matter. They've always had problems with everybody, but eventually it'll be the Gentiles. And so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here. But so Mizraim, we saw him, and then notice it says, and the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raama, Sabticha, the sons of Raama, Sheba, and Dedan. And so the darker skinned people too, your Africans, they would have come from Ham. And Ham, that name actually means hot. And so a lot of people think he was probably darker skinned, and that's why they named him Ham. And again, that's where a lot your darker skinned people would come from. And the Ethiopians came from Ham, the Egyptians came from Ham. So in verse 1 or 11, or no, 8, I'm sorry, keep getting lost. And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. And so later we're going to see them building a tower in the land of Shinar. Now, the Bible does not specifically mention this, but we do see that Nimrod was a mighty hunter. So Nimrod comes from Ham. Ham's kind of the bad one. Now, he's not a son of Canaan, but he did come from Ham. And the reality is, it was probably a bad thing that you have the leader of all of these people coming out of Ham's line. Because again, he was kind of a bad guy. And according to history, there's a lot of historical stuff that you can read about Nimrod. Most of it is from A lot of stuff from Alexander Hislop, which I think he was kind of a little bit of a Ruckmanite of the 1800s in a lot of ways. But he's got some interesting stuff for sure. But some of the things are pretty weird. But obviously, when Nimrod's leading, when Ham's line is leading, it's not good what's going on. And so we're going to see later, we're not going to take time to read it, but they decide they're going to build a tower, they're going to make a name for themselves. And so in reality, what we're seeing, the whole world's getting corrupt again. All these nations are getting corrupt. And so even though we've kind of have these different groups and these different people, understand what we're reading here in Genesis is more than likely, when it's naming off all these nations and things, something that happened after the Tower of Babel. Because at first they were all staying together. But then when God confounded their languages, that's when they began to spread out. And so this is showing us, the origin of those nations, but it's not necessarily going through everything in chronological order. It kind of goes through some chapters, gives some summaries, and then sometimes in the next chapter it goes back in time a little bit and then gives some more specifics. So that's one thing that can be a little confusing sometimes. But notice in verse 11, and out of the land went forth Asher, and he built Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calais, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calais, the same as the great city. And Mizraim begat Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtuhim, and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistim in Caphtorim. And Philistim, that's where the Philistines came from. And the Philistines were a huge problem for Israel. And so, but yeah, and then the thing is too, and I again don't want to get ahead of myself, but who's the most notable Philistine that we know? Goliath, right? So Goliath is a giant, right? But he's a Philistine. He's a Gittite. Goliath the Gittite is one thing he's called in the Bible. So we understand he comes from Ham. He doesn't come from, fallen angels. All right? It's not a mixed breed thing. And so verse 15, and Canaan begat Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, the Hamathite, and afterward were the family of the Canaanites spread abroad. And so, the Jebusites too, they were the ones that were, the name of their city was Jebus. Does anybody know what that later was changed to? Jerusalem. So, when you have the Canaanites, the Jebusites are one of the specific groups. They had Jerusalem. And Israel never completely ran them out of the land. And it was David that would eventually defeat the Jebusites and then take over Jerusalem. And they started there in that city of David, which is just kind of an interesting thing there. But then also, verse 19, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza, and as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboam, even unto Laishah. So this is where the Sodomites came from Ham. And we know they're like one of the most wicked groups ever, that God completely destroyed the Sodomites. Again, and we see Sodomites later coming out, but originally the Sodomites were a specific group, like some of these other groups. But then later, whenever you had these communities of LGBTs come together, they would just, what do you call these people? Let's call them Sodomites. Let's identify them with these other groups. And so I think it is, because unfortunately, reprobates and just sexual deviance can come from any people group, because when any child of Adam just goes and rejects God and crosses that point of no return, and God gives them a reprobate mind, there is just typical disgusting animalistic type behavior that you can expect from them. And so I think a good name to call them would be one that was associated with one of the most wicked groups that there ever were, that God completely destroyed. And so I think, whatever you want, I think one of the worst things we should call them is gay, because that sounds too pleasant, and they like that. And, and like the LGBT community, No, sodomites. Okay, sodomites is the best. It's the most biblical term for them. And again, because of the fact, too, they don't reproduce, they're not a race. Okay? It's not a race. For sure, it's not a race. God already wiped out the race. Okay? But at the same time, what they were known for, the sin, can't be wiped out. Even if they, if you were able to just, put on a Thanos glove and make them go away, eventually there would be new ones too, because it's just, they're a reminder of the depravity of man. But they originally were an actual group, an actual group of people that were just extremely, extremely wicked. And so when you see later groups, it has nothing to do with biology. It has absolutely nothing to do with biology. It has everything to do with just wicked sin. It's what you just call a group of people that are just completely vile. And so anyway, little lesson about sodomite history. You won't hear that during LGBTQ History Month in the public schools. But anyway, notice verse 20. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues and their countries and in their nations. And so all the giants in the Bible, they descend from Ham. I'm going to hit a few verses here. I don't have to take time to turn to all of them. Deuteronomy 2:9, and the Lord said unto me, distress not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle, for I will not give thee of their land for possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for possession. The Emims dwelt there in time past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, who were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Emims. The Horims also dwell in Seir before a time, but the children of Esau succeeded them when they had destroyed them from before them, and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did into the land of the possession which the Lord gave unto them. So notice all these Emims, Zamzumims, all these different groups with M at the end, I-M at the end of their name. These are all people that came from Ham, all these different groups. And so probably the only exception you'll see is some will say, and I don't know that these guys are necessarily giants, but weirdo Nephilim people. They love to talk about, when it's referring to David's mighty men, it talks about one who went and slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. And it's like, lion-like, meaning literally they were like part lion. It's like, that is stupid, okay? No, these guys, they were just obviously very strong. They were very, great warriors, and they are comparing them to lions because of their strength. So they very well could have been a giant. You say, well, the Moabites, they come from Shem because they were related to Abraham. But remember that Lot, when he went out of Sodom, he dwelt among these groups. And so his daughters, and their families probably mixed in with all these groups that were from Ham. So again, there's still a connection, even with the Moabites, that you can make to Ham because of that mixture that Lot had. And the Moabites were also a cursed people too. They absolutely were a cursed people. And again, did that mean that these cursed people had no hope for salvation or anything back in those days? No, because we have people like Ruth, the Moabitess. We see her, and we see how she's used of God greatly. In fact, she's in the line of Christ. So, just kind of some interesting things there. But Genesis 14:5, and in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, and Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh, and Kirithaim. And so right there is just kind of showing where these different groups come from. And notice they were from Ham, is where all these different giant groups were from. Amos 2:9 says, yet destroyed I the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above, and his roots from beneath. And so the Amorites, they were also from Ham. Okay, all these people come from Ham. We have in Genesis 10:16, it says, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite. And then another famous giant that they like to talk about was Og, king of Bashan. He was also an Amorite. They come from Ham, Joshua 2:10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what he did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And so again, just any place where you see a giant mentioned in the Bible, it always tells us where they were from, what people they were from, and they all go back to Ham. And why is it significant? Because again, Genesis is showing us the origin of the nations. That's what it's showing us. And when we were before the flood, it's just showing how the people got, the godly people got intermingled with the ungodly people, and it ruined the world. It absolutely destroyed the world. I've got a lot more verses on giants. I'm not going to take time to read them, but let's go ahead and go to Genesis 10:21. It says, and unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even unto him were children born. And so notice Eber is where the Hebrews come from. Okay? Hebrews come from Eber. And then the children of Shem, Elam, and Asher, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uz, and Hul, and Gether, and Mash. And notice Uz is mentioned there. Uz comes from Shem. Can anybody think of where Uz is mentioned in the Bible? There was a man who dwelt in the land of Uz, and his name was Job. Okay, so Job, who is another godly guy, notice he comes from Shem. That's where it seems to be the godly people are coming from. They're coming from the line of Shem. He was probably contemporary with Abraham. He's another saved guy, for sure, a righteous man. But it wasn't so much about genetics, but it was, there was definitely something better about this line than there was for sure about this line. Japheth, we don't really see anything special coming from him. You don't see much from his line anywhere in the Bible until centuries and centuries later when we have the rise of the Greek Empire. And so understand the reason why it kind of becomes Jews and Gentiles by the time we get to the time of Christ, it's because of the fact that it was that Greek Empire, and then you have the Roman Empire. The Gentiles were the ones that had kind of taken over the world during that time. There was a time when the Egyptians were the world power, where Ham is kind of the one running things. When you have Nimrod, that's the line of Ham kind of running things. And then later, the Egyptians kind of take back over. But then later, we see, the Jews, they become strong. We don't really see them conquering the world, but they were definitely a world power, like during Solomon's time. But then later, you have the Assyrians. And, but then later, the Gentiles are the ones that kind of take over. And then, so by the time, you get there, it's not that these other groups don't exist anymore, but when the Gentiles are kind of over all these different people groups, you can kind of see why the rest of the world was just associated with Gentiles. And so, I've heard some people say that, when the Bible says to the Jew first and also to the Greek, or to the Gentile, that we are still today literally supposed to prioritize the Jew first. That's dumb, okay? But then, if they want to take the stupidity to the next level, they'll go back to Genesis and show how the Gentiles are separate from these other groups. And so, basically, we should prioritize the Gentiles before Ham, or more specifically, the black people, is what I've literally heard them do, which is pretty sad because, today, typically, it's people from here that are the most receptive to the gospel. So, it's amazing some of the things that people come up with. A lot of people, too, who are against interracial dating. They will tell you it is okay to interracial marry as long as you stay within one of these three categories. So as long as people descend from Japheth, they are allowed to intermarry. So like white people and Mexicans, they're allowed to intermarry according to these people because they're from Japheth. But we can't be marrying black people because they're from Ham. That's not right. And apparently we can't do people that are Semitic as well. That sounds anti-Semitic. But anyway, first off, that's just dumb, okay? That is dumb, and I'm not here today to prove why that's not something that we ought to be worrying about, but that's just really dumb stuff. And it's just sad because people will they'll read all these facts from the Bible about where the different nations come from. So like, man, they're giving a lot of Bible. And then after they've just read a whole bunch of Bible and given a whole bunch of facts that are accurate, oh, and by the way, these people can't marry within these people. It's like, just stop. Please stop. But anyway, so verse 24, it's Shem's line. And Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begat Eber. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. That's probably a reference to the Tower of Babel. During Peleg's day, the earth was divided, and that's when God confounded their language, and then all of these groups, they spread out and started their own nations, because ultimately that's what we're seeing here. And I'm not going to take time to read all these names, but it's just basically, this is showing us where all the nations come from. So basically, what we're seeing here, this is how the nations were divided up. And, pretty much all the main people that we see in the Old Testament, the different groups that are mentioned, we have their origins. Whether we're talking about the Egyptians, they're from Ham, showing us where they came from. The Canaanites, they're from Ham. All the real bad ones are from Ham. We have the Edomites, okay? They're from Shem. And we have the Moabites, that they were also from Shem, but they kind of mixed in with these people of Ham, and they were really bad. You have, what are some other big people groups? Later on we've got the Gentiles. They're going to show up. The Bible doesn't really talk much about the Greeks. That most of that is in between the Old and New Testament when a lot of that stuff went on. But most of the battles that you see the Jews fighting are with these people and with other groups from these people, because these people were just in close proximity to them geographically. The people from Ham, they were a lot closer to them. They settled a lot of the areas of Africa, but also the Canaanites specifically were in the land that God had prepared for them. And they were a very cursed people. And just like the curse of Cain had passed on to all the people from Seth who intermingled with them, one of the things that we see when Israel would mix with the Canaanites, all the junk would spread. Well, it was always the gods of the Canaanites that they were serving. It was always the sins, the abominations of the Canaanites. They would have problems with the Sodomites. They're also from Canaan. So most of Israel's biggest problems were specifically from the Canaanites. But then pretty much any of the other ones, it was from other people that were from Ham. And so the thing is, over here though, these nations aren't as bad, but they were idolatrous. They did have problems. Abraham, who was from Syria, okay, he came from an idolatrous family. They're famous in that too, but Abraham ended up being a man of great faith. God ends up choosing specifically Abraham out of this line. And so from Abraham, what we end up seeing when we're in Genesis, when we get to Abraham, when God chooses him in the next, after the story of the Tower of Babel, okay, it gives us a bunch of names, shows some history, but then ultimately the focus goes to this guy. Why? Because God still has a promise to keep that he had made to Adam. And God has decided, I am going to keep it through this man. He is not the only saved man in the world. Job is around during his time. There were sons of God in the earth in his day, because they would go and present themselves before the Lord. Probably you have Melchizedek walking the earth during his day. Okay, now I don't believe this, but some people believe that Melchizedek was actually Shem. And if you do the timelines, Shem lived well past the time of Abraham. Shem, I don't have my notes on that in front of me here, but he would have lived until the time at least of Jacob, I believe. So it's weird to think about Shem, a guy who was from before the flood, a guy who was on Noah's Ark, is walking the earth same time as him. And so if you read the book of Jasher, Shem is Melchizedek. And I think that's where that theory comes from. But just kind of another, I'm not saying these things are factual. I'm just saying what people say. But Nimrod, who his kingdom it mentions was in the land of Shinar. The Tower of Babel was built in the land of Shinar. And later on in the Bible, during Abraham's time, you have Amraphel, king of Shinar. And according to the book of Jasher, after the Tower of Babel, that was another name that was given to Nimrod. That's actually a reference to Nimrod. And obviously, again, I don't think the book of Jasher is biblical. And I love all the clowns who want to say that Jasher should be in the Bible, because most of those people, too, also will say the book of Enoch should be in the Bible. Well, what's hilarious about that, those two books greatly conflict with each other. Both of them have conflicts with the Bible, too, but they have bigger conflicts with each other. So it's like, you have to pick one. If you're going to even try to add one of them, you're going to only be able to pick one, because they teach two completely different things. The book of Enoch teaches that the sons of God were angels. The book of Jasher teaches that they were the sons of Seth. So they're gonna have to take their pick. But either way, these nations were going to be a thorn in the flesh for the Jews who came from Abraham. And God warned them about that, and God warned them. God wanted Abraham to command his children after him so they wouldn't do the abominations of all these other people, but they kept disobeying. But the whole Bible is God miraculously preserving Abraham's seed, preserving the one that the Messiah is going to come from, and that's Jesus Christ. And so we'll go ahead and shut it down right there, but hopefully that helps you kind of understand these things. And if you have any questions about some of the specific groups too, and just think about that sometime when you're going through the Bible. Anytime you see a different group, just ask yourself, where do they come from? And the Bible probably tells you. Those things are there for a reason, and it kind of makes the genealogies less boring when you're reading through. It's more than just a bunch of difficult names to pronounce. And so with that, let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your word and the lessons we can learn from it. I pray you'll bless everyone for it. Pray you'll bless the service coming up in the next hour. In your name we pray. Amen.